We're a half hour late with my starting my update, and uh, our main live stream guy had to run home because he had an emergency there. So we've it's like there's a whole bunch of things that are sort of converging that indicate that we want to do. So I'm going to call today's update Convergence Exponentialized. And my wife told me it was okay to use that, even though I'm not sure exponentialized is actually a word, but I think you know what it means. It means that things are increasing even more quickly as we move closer and closer to that period of time we know is the 70th week of Daniel and all the things that happen there. And some things that might happen before that, some wars and that type of thing. It's just, and this week I thought, well, it's funny because each week I think, whenever I think I've got everything in hand and I've got plenty of time, is when I have less time to finish because so many other things are happening. So just a couple of notes about some plans. In 2 weeks, my hope, assuming everything works out correctly, is to do a prophecy update from Jerusalem. I think I have a film crew lined up. I have some other things. So Pam and I will be going there for a little while. Fortunately or unfortunately, we'll be in Jerusalem at the same time President Trump is. So I'm sure that, and we're staying very close to the old city. So I'm sure traffic is going to be getting around is going to be a bit of a nightmare. So just pray that our trip goes well and we don't end up with, something like the airlines, ERR lines. I don't know if you saw this story about Delta. Couple got on in Maui to fly back to Los Angeles. They had a 16-year-old son they had sent back the day before, but they checked with the airline. People said, yeah, you can use his ticket and you can put one of your children in a car seat in that seat, which they did. And then the airlines came on as some employee and said, you can't do that. You can't have a car seat. The guy said, we flew out here with the car seat, the kid in the car seat. We paid for the ticket. If you don't hold that kid the rest of the way, you're going to be arrested and your kids will be put in foster care, which is really great customer service. And I just think it's indicative of the way things are going in the world. Everything seems out of control. I see somebody put up a Facebook post. I put up a Facebook post. Please pray for Jack Hibbs. He's been suffering from severe insomnia. He's taking a leave of absence from his church to try to, and this has been going on for a couple years, sleeping 1 to 3 hours a night. I mean, it's just not good for your health. And I put it up, and a lot of people said, I'm praying for him. And then people started suggesting things, and then people started judging people for suggesting things. And I'm like, folks, the point of this is to pray for Jack Hibbs. And it's like, I'm not sure I understand. Now, you may not believe this, but I spent a lot of time in my life self-censoring, not saying what's on my mind, not typing what I want to say in response to a Facebook post, not sending an email. Now, you may not believe that, but trust me, there's a lot of stuff going on in here that just never gets out. Or I would be doing this too, and I don't know why every Facebook post, you can discuss things, but I don't know why it has to turn into this really heated argument. I just don't think it's healthy. So the couple actually had to get off the flight, get a hotel room, and spend $2,000 on tickets for the next day. Delta said they're working with them on compensation. From my perspective, Delta could offer them free flights for life. And I don't know that it would be enough. To threaten people with put your kids in foster care is just over the top. Now, this is an interesting convergence of technology. It's called Globe Chat. And essentially what it does is it allows you to chat with anyone in the world regardless of language. It's sort of a reversal of the Tower of Babel. I think this is the type of thing that's very indicative that we do live in the end times, and all of the, there's a lot of scripture that indicates that we're kind of going back to Babel. Man is going to think that we know everything, and they're going to rise up and do things. So today we're going to take a look at a number of things. We're going to talk a little bit about Israel, a lot about Israel and the Middle East, and some things going on. So this one is, here's one. Warning, this is the new cover of Time magazine. We are not ready for the next pandemic. And it says the next global security threat isn't what you think. I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I played a sort of a scenario where you can go into at this website, you can enter your address, and then it tells you where like you get sick with smallpox or something, and you go to the hospital, and it shows how the infection spreads. And within 25 days, 1 billion people are dead because you went to the doctor's office. And it's not too inaccurate. There's thousands of these outbreaks, and they're able to contain them. But at some point, there's going to be a superbug that I think is going to be very difficult to contain. And I think that has huge prophetic implications. We can read about, a global epidemic of people dying within the confines of the 70th week. And the point of it is that with air flights and that type of thing, I mean, look, in a week or so, Pam and I will get on a plane. We'll fly to New York. I think we leave at 5 o'clock at night, and we leave New York about 10:30, and we have an overnight flight, and we get to Jerusalem. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. But we've flown thousands and thousands of miles. You can get on a plane, and in less than a day, you can be pretty much anywhere on the planet, any major city. That's good and that's bad. There are implications to that being able to travel like that. Mass consumption or mass production and transportation of goods. Frankly, I marvel every time I go to the grocery store for a couple reasons. One, I can find what I'm actually looking for. For some reason, Kroger, we usually go to Kroger, but it seems like Kroger has this, it doesn't matter what 2 items I need to get. They are on opposite ends of the store. So I got to cover the whole store. And why Kroger has the bread from that's already pre-wrapped here on the far right in near the vegetables, and the bakery at the far back corner of the store is beyond me, but they're breaking me. So I recently liked root beer, and I finally found IBC root beer at Kroger. I didn't know where it was, and I came home, and Pam said, "Where did you find it?" I said, "Well, I found it in the IBC root beer aisle." So anyway, a few things about the church. There's a great article in Evangelical Focus by Will Graham, 10 Concerns Francis Schaeffer Took to the Grave. This is from a couple months ago, but I just saw it pop up on my Facebook feed. And it's interesting that this man went back and he looked at some of the things that Francis Schaeffer talked about when he wrote this book, The Great Evangelical Disaster 30 years ago. And then he looked at 10 themes that Schaeffer raised in that book. And I'll just read you the list of those 10. And it's interesting what you'll see. So you can get the evangelicalfocus.com. Concerns Francis Schaeffer Took to the Grave. And it's pretty stunning. Look at these. Growing relativism, 30 years ago. Lack of discipline. That was lack of discipline in the church. Church discipline had completely broken down. Now, we live 30 years down the road, and all of these are still problems. In fact, they're magnified. They've grown exponentially, in my judgment. Compromise with the world and the church. A growing emphasis on social work rather than sharing the gospel. And boy, go look at some of the evangelical blogs now, and it's all about, we have to go feed the poor, or, and and there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But you remember one of the people, I can't remember his name now, from that's associated with Finish Line over in Malawi, and he had said, he's a pastor in Africa, very, very poor country. If you talk to them, they get a little bowl of some starch every day. Maybe they'll get a little piece of fish. That's what they eat. And he said, look, you evangelicals in America, stop sending us water trucks. Stop sending us all these things that you want us to do, water trucks so we can drill for more water. Send us preachers of the gospel because we're dying, and what we desperately need is the gospel. And we have a tendency to lose that perspective here in the West. And so what happened 100 or so years ago with the liberal denominations and led to their decline is exactly what's happening in the evangelical church today, and has been happening. Those of you who've been in classes that I've taught for over the last 20 years, we've been talking about this for 20 years. And so we didn't learn the lessons from what happened to the mainline Protestant denominations. We just repeated them, and we're actually doing it probably more, and everything's happening much more quickly. Ecumenism, abortion, liberalism, hedonism, loss of propositional revelation, and a loss of a concept of inerrancy of scriptures, and the sufficiency of Scripture, I might add, at that. So look up that article. I don't really have time to go through it, but it's very well done, and it shows that God does raise up people within every generation that speak in a prophetic sense and a Jeremiah sense. You need to change these things or God's going to judge you. A lot of people don't like Jeremiah, but as one commentator once said, hey, Jeremiah was right. And people didn't pay attention to him. We know the stories of kings and in Chronicles and Kings where one king, he had 500 prophets. And he said, and only this one tells me bad news. There's only one, so, maybe the ratio is 500 bad prophets to one good one. That might be not too inaccurate. Somebody just sent me this morning, and I was looking through an interview about this book, The Political Pope. I only raise it because we've talked about this for a long time. I have said repeatedly, if you remember when the Pope came to Washington, he went to Congress and he spoke to Congress, and what he talked about was he mentioned three people. He mentioned Martin Luther King. He mentioned Dorothy Day, who is a radical communist leftist, socialist, whatever you want to, just radical leftist. This was a great example to him. And then he also mentioned Merton, the Cistercian monk who died in India and has really swept into evangelicalism through a number of avenues, particularly in spiritual formation programs in churches and seminaries, and brought in this mysticism. And Merton was he was a mystic. He claimed to be Catholic. He was in a monastery for most of his life down in outside of Louisville. But he died overseas because he went over there to meet with his Hindu and Buddhist brothers in mysticism. And he died over there. In fact, he got his obituary probably 30 years ago or so. It's maybe 50 years ago. He was only about 52 or so when he died. He got a half page in the New York Times. Now we say, oh, well, that's just the New York Times. Well, if that's just the New York Times, why are evangelical seminaries and churches and these spiritual formations protesting this man? I'm not protesting, promoting this man. They should be protesting him. But not. You can read evangelical author after evangelical author. You can go and look at chapel services at major evangelical colleges and institutions where they talk about how great Thomas Merton is. And nothing Merton said will get you saved. it's all a bunch of experience. Well, I raised that because this Pope thought it was important enough, Merton was important enough, that he wanted to talk about him when he went to speak in front of Congress. And very few people. I doubt that we talked about it. I know some other pastors talked about it, but very few mentioned how significant this was. So now there's a new book out written by a Catholic man, George Neumeyer. Why don't people spell their names phonetically? So George wrote this book, The Political Pope, How Pope Francis is delighting the liberal left and abandoning conservatives. Listen to just some of this because I think this is important, and because it backs up what I said. Now, not endorsing his Catholic outlook or anything like that. What I'm saying is this is a Catholic Jesuit-trained person who's saying this about the Pope. And what do we see evangelicals doing? Kenneth Copeland, Robeson, James and Betty Robeson, John and Carol Arnott, Tony Palmer, they're running, Rick Warren, Roma Downey, the list is endless, of Joel Osteen. All these people go to Rome to praise the Pope. Listen to what this Catholic says about it. For the first moment I saw him, I knew that he was going to be a modernist wrecking ball, and he struck me from the beginning as the prototypical progressive Jesuit. I knew it was an extremely bad sign, this is in an interview that he gave, that the church would name the first Jesuit pope at the very moment the Jesuit order was in its most corrupt and heterodox condition. I knew it was going to be a distressingly historic pontificate, and from the first moment of Francis' papacy, I began thinking that his pontificate would be a good subject for a book. As it unfolded, it became clearer and clearer that someone needed to chronicle this consequently chaotic pontificate. I don't think he's getting invited to the Vatican anytime soon. Having gone to a Jesuit university, I am very familiar with the flakes and frauds that populate that order. When I heard the Pope in the first few months of his pontificate engage in nonstop left-wing babble, it reminded me of all the nonsense that I heard as a student from similar progressive Jesuits. The program of Francis was so obviously set to promote political liberalism while downplaying doctrine. That was the formula of trendy and empty Catholicism that I saw on display at the Jesuit University of San Francisco. Probably not going to be alumni of the year there either. Pope Francis is a product of political leftism and theological modernism. His mind has been shaped by all of the post-Enlightenment heresies and ideologies from Marx to Freud to Darwin. He is the realization of Cardinal Carlo Martini's vision of a modernist church that conforms to the heresies of the Enlightenment. On almost all intellectual fronts, Francis is a follower of the modernist school. He's a student of modernist biblical scholarship, which can be seen in his ludicrous interpretation of certain passages from the gospel, such as the time when he described the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes as a metaphor and not a miracle. On more than one occasion, he said it was not a miracle, but a lesson in sharing. This was the miracle, quoting from Francis. Rather than a multiplication, it is a sharing, inspired by faith and prayer. Everyone eats and some is left over. It is the sign of Jesus, the bread of God for humanity. Question, the interviewer asked him, are his political statements in line with Catholic teaching? Answer, many of his statements are not in line with the Church's teaching, as I document in the book. Pope Francis is the worst teacher of the faith in the history of the Catholic Church. One could not trust him to teach an elementary school religion class. Well, when you describe, he said, do you have any proof of this? I speak about this at the beginning of the book. His mentor was Esther Balestrino de Carrega, who was a very fervent communist. Francis has acknowledged that he had teachers who were communists who influenced him. I point out in my book that he also met with the widow of the Paulo Freire, the author of the book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a classic of the socialist left in Latin America. How would you describe his moral teaching? Answer, he pays homage to the moral relativism and socialism that are at the heart of the global left. It is no coincidence that his signature phrases have been, "Who am I to judge?" and "Inequality is the root of all evil." He is a darling of the global left because he is advancing many of the items of their agenda, such as climate change activism, open borders, and the abolition of lifetime imprisonment, a position so far left that not even the U.S. Democrats take that position. He is a spokesman for gun control, for the world government, for the redistribution of wealth by central planners. And he goes on. You can go find that. Just look up the political pope, and maybe I'll try to put it on my Facebook page if I remember it when I get home. This is stunning. And what's so stunning to me is the evangelicals who beat a path to this leftist door to praise him as if he's a great paragon of the faith. The man is totally, completely, undisputably apostate. And evangelicals need to get over the bromance with this guy and stop it. Even the New York Times this week, Monday was May Day, and we know May Day is Communism Day. And so last Sunday, in the New York Times editorial page, they had an op-ed by this lady, Vivian Gornick, who grew up in a home of communists here in the United States. And so her thing was, when communism inspired Americans. Now, listen, I didn't grow up in that environment because communism was clearly evil. Look at what she says in this. It is perhaps hard to understand now, but at that time in this place, the Marxist vision of world solidarity is translated by the Communist Party, induced the most ordinary of men and women a sense of one's own humanity that ran deep, made life feel large, and clarified. It came to this clarity of inner being that so many of us became not only attached, but addicted. No reward of life, no love, nor fame, nor wealth could compete with the experience. Do you see how when the guy who wrote The Political Pope talks about the modernist pope, or the postmodernist, what are they all about? Feelings. I mean, right, wrong, they don't mean anything. It's just, look at what's going on in the sexual realm in our culture. It's all about feelings. Nothing more than feelings. It was this all in oneness, it was this all and allness of world and self that all too often made of the communists true believers who could not face up to the police state corruption at the heart of their faith, even when a 3-year-old could see that it was eating itself alive. Now, I'm glad she was honest, that this whole communist system was completely corrupt and oppressive, but the experience made us feel so good. And now that we see this in the church, where people can't stand up to evil and call it out. Well, this week, there are a couple important meetings. My slides are out of order because I'm trying to get them done at the last minute. This was interesting. There's a meeting this week between Merkel and Putin and Sochi. And she's pressing him and saying, you are mistreating gays and Jehovah's Witnesses. And gays in Chechnya are being put in concentration camps and in prison. And Putin is sort of saying, don't tell me what to do. You got your own problems. You know, you got all those immigrants down there raping women in your country. Don't talk to me and be self-righteous. In our country, the Ninth Circuit issued another decision rejecting a challenge to a California law protecting youth from conversion therapy. The Ninth Circuit issued this decision and said, you know, you can't do this. And it was appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came out this week and said, we're not going to review it on appeal. Not that important. So in California now, you do gay conversion therapy, try to change somebody, and it's against the law. And it's interesting because they say you're born that way, but when you actually are born a certain way, they will change you. if you want. And they'll change it back and forth, as long as the money holds out. So this is crazy. I didn't have time to do the clip, but this is a very interesting debate that took place this week at Purdue. Professor on the left was arguing in favor of abortion. And this person was a pro-life person. I can't remember their names. And the guy in the hat, the cool hat, I guess, it looks like some throwback to some of those movies that I saw in the 70s and 80s where people wore a skinny version of John Candy and Uncle Buck, because he had a hat like that in Uncle Buck. So his argument was, you show pictures of fetuses, little fetuses, and they don't have clothes on. That's child pornography. Now, you know what the response was? And I think it came from one of the students there, who were mostly pro-life, said, oh, so you admit it's a child. Oh, I'm not admitting it's a child. So at least some people at Purdue are getting it. And you can watch the whole debate. You can find it on YouTube. So this was Communist Day in Paris. This cop was burned, I think, third-degree burns over a good portion of his body by peaceful protesters, anarchists, throwing Molotov cocktails, shutting down central Paris. Now, as we speak, there's an election going on between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. And the exit polls are showing that Macron is going to probably win. He's with about 60% of the vote. And he'll be the new president of France. He's an interesting guy. He's 39. It's interesting that there's the same age difference between Macron and his spouse as there is between Donald Trump and his spouse. It's reversed. His wife he's 39, she's like 63 or 64. She was, I think, his high school teacher. But Bret Stephens has an interesting comment in the New York Times, where he's now the most hated op-ed contributor. I've lost a lot of respect for Bret over time, but he wrote an article about climate change not being maybe as bad as everybody said. And boy, the New York Times subscribes. I'm leaving the New York Times. I can't believe you published this radical right-wing stuff. And he's not really a radical right-wing guy. But the calculated rise of Emmanuel Macron. This is very interesting. I came across this guy a few months ago. And if you look at the article in here, I think that Stephens says this: that's the real story of this election, the most stunning aspect of which isn't that the French might possibly install a crypto-fascist in the Elysee Palace. It's that they seem strongly inclined to elect a former Rothschild investment banker who evinces no sense of guilt about his elite pedigree, capitalist profession, and market-friendly economic inclinations that include tax cuts for corporations and an easing of the 35-hour work week. And so here's this guy. It's interesting in this article. At the height of the financial crisis, Rothschild assigned one of its veteran bankers to groom a new hire named Emmanuel Macron. Mr. Macron had no experience in banking. Instead, he had powerful mentors who had recommended him to Rothschild as literally a high society dancer who could drum up business. And so I'm sure that all the people who like the Rothschild conspiracy theories will be just apoplectic about the fact that this is all over the front page of newspapers. And he has seemed to have this rise come out of nowhere. He's never held political office, and now he's going to be the president of France. So yeah, I know. I'm glad we've never elected anybody to be president that's never held political office before. So it's interesting, and so Gatestone Institute, highly recommend that you read it, subscribe to it. I get their daily emails. They write great articles. This one is in today, France, Emmanuel Macron, useful idiot of Islamism. And so he doesn't really have, he's not a supporter of terrorism or Islamism. It's worse. He does not even see the threat. Macron's political movement has largely been infiltrated by Muslim Brotherhood militants. Is Macron an open promoter of Islamism in France? It is more politically correct to say that he is a globalist and an open promoter of multiculturalism. As such, he does not consider Islamism a national threat because the French nation, or as he has said, French culture, does not really exist. Another article engaged on this week, Europe's childless leaders sleepwalking us to disaster. And the point that they make is that Europe's most important leaders are all childless. Merkel, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and the French presidential hopeful Emmanuel Macron. The list continues with Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, Luxembourg's Prime Minister, and Scottish First Minister. Why is this important? As Europe's leaders have no children, they seem to have no worry about the future of their continent. German philosopher Rudiger Safransky wrote, "For the childless, thinking in terms of the generations to come loses relevance. Therefore, they behave more and more as if they were the last and see themselves as standing at the end of the chain." With everything else that's going on in the world, the convergence of culture, politics, Middle East, Israel, Jerusalem, all this, now throw into the mix that the cultural, political leaders of Europe, by and large, are nihilists. It's like, when I die, it's all over anyway, so why do I need to do anything about future generations? And you can see this in Angela Merkel quite well, as she just brings in everybody under the sun to do this. In Eastern Europe, though, they haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. And they say Syrian refugees are not welcome in Eastern Europe. And articles I read this week said that there are 8 to 10 million more refugees that are ready to come right now to Europe. That will collapse Europe. Any demographic projections that put off Muslim majorities to 2050 or 2060 or anything like that, just don't pay attention to them. If this happens, and I do think it will, I think Putin and Erdogan see an opportunity to sort of weaponize Sunni immigration into Europe to collapse it even further and get their way. It's going to happen much more quickly. So in Hungary, 70% of people don't like that. In the Times last Sunday, Andrew Murray had a great article. Europe signs its own death warrant. And it's here I should point out the usual verses that we use in 1st and 2nd Timothy about, in the end times, people will be given over to myths. In Romans chapter 1, we see people given over to reprobate minds. And essentially what you see, the theme of a people in the end times that aren't redeemed is they lose the ability to reason. They don't even see this coming. I've talked to people that I've met randomly, like in an airport or something. I raise this subject, or they see me working on this, and they're like, where are you getting that? They don't even know. And so here's the Times of London, great newspaper. Europe is signing its own death warrant. Listen to a little bit of what he says. Europe is committing suicide, or at least its leaders have decided to commit suicide. Whether the European people choose to go along with this is naturally another matter. When I say that Europe is in the process of killing itself, I do not mean that the burden of European Commission regulation has become overbearing, or that the European Convention on Human Rights has not done enough to satisfy the demands of a particular community. I mean that the civilization we know as Europe is in the process of committing suicide, and that neither Britain or any other Western European country can avoid that fate, because we all appear to suffer from the same symptoms and maladies. As a result, by the end of the lifespans of most people currently alive, Europe will not be Europe, and the peoples of Europe will have lost the only place in the world we had to call home. Europe today has little desire to reproduce itself, fight for itself, or even take its own side in an argument. Those in power seem persuaded that it would not matter if the people and culture of Europe were lost to the world. And so what are they going to do in France today? They're going to elect a millennial to the presidency who's this way. So all the stuff that you've seen about, we've talked about Europe and the problems in France and the problems in France with the unrestricted immigration that they've had. Do you think they're going to slow down or accelerate? It's going to be, can I use the term, exponentialized? The culture produced by the tributaries of Judeo-Christian culture, the ancient Greeks and Romans, and the discoveries of the Enlightenment has not been leveled by nothing. But the final act has come about because of two simultaneous you got them, sets of linked events from which it is now all but impossible to recover. When I get thirsty, multisyllabic, I'm not very good at being multisyllabic. So, he talks about the influx of migrants and how that's going to contribute to this. And they talked about, they always say, well, these people will integrate by either in the first generation that comes or the second, but that never happens. And he says this, all the time we waved away the great likelihood that it just wouldn't work. This is a conclusion that the migration crisis of recent years has simply accelerated. Which brings me to the second point. For even the mass movement of millions of people into Europe would not sound such, he's British, he has to use these long words, would not sound such a final note for the continent were it not for the fact that, coincidental or otherwise, at the same time, Europe lost faith in its beliefs, traditions, and legitimacy. It's a great article, so you can go and read that in the Times of London. Okay. Real quick. North Korea. I mentioned last week Gordon Chang, I think I played a clip of him, that maybe these are not missile failures, that they're actually controlled first stage tests. I think that's very much more likely. Particularly if you watch one of them, you see that it was like they were controlling the rise and they were using the nozzles to see how they could turn it and that type of thing. And then they exploded it over their own country because they would want to do that because we would go get the parts if it exploded over Japan or the ocean because we want to know what they're doing. So it's this problem almost has no solution that is attractive to anyone. Another problem that's heating up right now is ISIS is growing like crazy on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Afghanistan itself is in pretty much meltdown. Any gains that were made while we were involved there are pretty much gone away. An interesting thing that took place this week is that in Astana, Kazakhstan, they signed an agreement involving Russia, Iran, and Turkey to set up de-escalation zones within Syria. They divided it up into 4 zones, and this is a man who's protesting. He's representing Syrian rebels, and he said, this is a travesty. You're condemning us to death. But the people who govern these countries think they now have a solution. The problem is that as you look at it, and this meeting in Astana, Kazakhstan, I think I'm saying that correctly, right after that meeting, then they had, of course, we had Merkel meeting, and we had Erdogan going to Sochi as well, just before Merkel, to have talks with Vladimir Putin. Trump and Putin also had a long conversation about Syria. Immediately, what came out of that telephone call is anybody's guess, because the Americans said this is what it was about, and the Russians said this is what it was about, which seems to be typical when you're dealing with the Russians. But, you know, our own State Department doesn't always tell the truth either. So I think that Trump probably said we'll talk about it when we get together at the G7 or G20 summit in a couple weeks in June. But Putin wants to control the narrative. But the interesting thing was that in this briefing that they had, and you can see these Russian generals down here at the bottom, they had this giant map of Syria, or what we still call Syria. We pretend that there's still a country called Syria because it makes us feel good that there's a country. 600,000 people dead. Of course, this is and you see these different zones that they've set up. But the interesting one is, and these zones are supposed to be no-fly zones. And Russia's going to enforce them. And so what you see when you look at that is, essentially down in the Golan, Russia and Syria and Iran are trying to set up a no-fly zone down there in the Golan and then all the way up around Damascus. I think to shut down the Israeli Air Force's attacks on those areas, because they want to keep weapons from getting, any more weapons from getting to Hezbollah, who's in the pink area there to the right. The city of Dara, I think, is this one. And this is where I know people aren't going to see this little one down here at the bottom that you can't read, all the way at the bottom. Over here, you know, there's the Golan, the Sea of Galilee is over here, and that's where the Syrian civil war started back in March of 2011. As soon as we reach, approaching 7 years in a year. The Saudis have rejected talks with Iran. And this alliance kind of plays into prophetic end time scenario, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And here's another one. This is the Kurds. And the Kurds are now saying, so, you know, we go back to this map, and we know that the Kurds live in northern Syria, Iraq, and then also over into Iran. And they're saying, we're going to have our own state all the way to the Mediterranean. What's that mean? Turkey and them are going to be at odds. Iran's going to step in. It's going to join Turkey. Russia's going to step in, join Turkey and Iran. This is an end-time alliance from Ezekiel 38 and 39 lining up right in front of our eyes. And when you see Saudis not wanting to be part of it, what's that line up with? Well, it lines up with the passages, too, that Sheba and Dedan sort of sit out the Ezekiel 38 and 39 invasion. So the Kurds want their own state. Now let's talk about Israel in the last hour that we have here. And UNESCO never disappoints in getting it wrong. They came out with a resolution early this week, published on the day that Israel celebrated its 69th Independence Day. Now, it happened on May 14th, 1948, but the Jewish calendar operates a little bit differently, so May 14th, 1948 might be celebrated on May 2nd, 2017. The end of the Six-Day War, June 7th, 1967, is going to be celebrated on May 24th of this year. It's the same day on the Jewish calendar in the Jewish month. So that's why this happens. But UNESCO says no Israeli links to Jerusalem. And they're going to say this until the Lord returns. They're deluded. They don't know what they're talking about. But, you know, the UN funds them. Now, Netanyahu, in response to that, he called in the Swedish ambassador to Israel and said, "Why'd you vote for this?" And he also said, "We're cutting off any Israeli funding to these organizations." So good for him. The president of Israel, while this resolution was coming to the fore, said that urges the world to recognize Jerusalem and move their embassies to Jerusalem. Now, there's a lot of talk about whether Trump's going to do that when he comes in May 22nd, 23rd. I personally don't think he's going to do it. It would really inflame things and cause a lot of problems. I hope that he does, but I think he'll make a statement that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel, and that's going to be enough. This is what the article Times of Israel says. Foreign dignitaries have been coming to Jerusalem for 70 years to participate in official meetings at the Knesset, the president's residence and prime minister's office, Rivlin said. Addressing the gathered Democrats directly, the 77-year-old Rivlin said that when most of them were born, Jerusalem was already Israel's capital city. You were born to the fact of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. You know no other reality. Since the days of King David, there was not, there is not, and there never will be any other reality, he said. And the one thing I think I see is I see the Israelis, the Jewish people in Israel, becoming more committed to this. Rivlin said, Jerusalem has always been the center of the Jewish world, the place we have prayed toward for thousands of years. There was never any doubt that Jerusalem would be the capital of Israel. And 50 years ago, we returned to the old city of Jerusalem. We united the whole city under Israeli sovereignty. We felt then that the dream of Jerusalem as the physical and spiritual capital of Israel has finally become a reality. Early in the week, there was all this, everybody was, oh, Hamas has backed off. Hamas has issued this great statement that they really want to make peace. The leader of Hamas is retiring. He's been the leader for 21 years. One of the great modern miracles is that this man has survived at the head of a terrorist organization for 21 years. He doesn't live in Gaza. He doesn't live in Judea or Samaria. He lives in Qatar, and he kind of moves around to different hotels, and he has these sponsors, and Qatar's a big sponsor of all this. At the same time, the Wall Street Journal had a good article yesterday about that Arab monarchies are now recognizing Israel more and more as an ally, but these are people that are really excluded from the Ezekiel 38-39 scenario, like the Saudis. So Hamas issues this report, and you see this headline, Hamas tempers extreme stances in bid for power. Did they really? I don't think so. And this is what the New York Times article says. Hamas said in its document that it is an Islamic Palestinian national liberation movement aimed at liberating Palestine and confronting the Zionist project, indicating that Islam is a reference in its principles, objectives, and means. The movement renewed its rejection of all projects aimed at settling the refugee issues, stressing that the right of return for Palestinian refugees is a natural right. It also stressed that not an inch of Palestine land will be handed over, indicating that the establishment of a state on the lines of 1967 does not mean the recognition of the Zionist entity. And I could spend a lot of time going through the various provisions. I'll kind of cut to the chase on this. Look at what it says. Palestine is the cause of a people who have been let down by the world that fails to secure their rights and restore them. What has been usurped from them, a people whose land continues to suffer one of the worst types of occupation in the world. I'm not sure it's that bad of an occupation in some senses. Actually, a clever blog put up this. This is the suffering Palestinian shopping malls and markets that they have in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. It's maybe not that bad. Let's see. Here's what it says. Principle 20 in their new statement. Hamas believes that no part of the land of Palestine shall be compromised or conceded, irrespective of the causes, the circumstances, and the pressures, and no longer how long the occupation lasts. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from river to the sea. They haven't changed anything. And these crazy people in our press, oh, look at, they're changing, they're reaching out, they want peace. No, they want, well, they do want peace. They want that peace and that peace and that peace for their own. Hamas affirms the Oslo Accords. That's kind of interesting. You know, I've speculated that maybe the Oslo Accords is what an Antichrist will confirm. It's still viable. It's the one they talk about the most. So the Benjamin Netanyahu's office, a spokesperson came out and said this.
Well, this is an obvious attempt by Hamas to fool the world, to pull the wool over the eyes of the world. And it's not the first time that tyrants and terrorists have lied to the world to alleviate pressure.
And so Hamas did elect a new leader as the old chief was on his way out. And the name escapes me for the moment. Person actually lives in Gaza this time, so they'll actually have a Palestinian. Always use, just assume when I say Palestinian, you know, put the scare quotes around it. Yeah, this new statement was not released in Gaza or Ramallah or anyplace else. It was released at a luxury hotel in Doha in Qatar. So you should be glad I'm going through this because we could be here for a while. In the New York Times article that talks about this, it references a new book that's coming out in about a week called The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine. Now, I could read you a lot from the book and some of the descriptions of the book. I will tell you that this book appears, I haven't been able to release just what people have said about it that have been given advanced copies. New York Times says, oh, this is one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on. And so who does this person praise as the great American president with regard to Israel and the Palestinians? Not Obama. Jimmy Carter, right. How brave he was, how wonderful he was. And, I mean, you can, like, this is a screen capture from some of the books. You can get pages of the book. And it talks about Jimmy Carter and what he did and how wonderful this was. Carter squeezed Israel harder on the Palestinian issue than any American president before or since. He believed Israel would make peace only if forced by the United States, and he saw the denial of Palestinian self-determination as moral. And it goes on to quote from Jimmy Carter, and I will spare you that pain. But suffice it to say that while the book does have a little bit of negative statements towards the Palestinians, the Arab Palestinians, it really comes down hard on Israel. Israel's really the problem. Israel's the one that needs to fix this. So on Wednesday, I didn't like this. The president welcomed Mahmoud Abbas to the White House. He's a terrorist. He hates Jews. And they had a joint conference, and Mahmoud Abbas got up and he said, we teach our children about peace. It's what they do. They lie. It was a total lie. Now, President Trump was diplomatic and didn't say anything. I would have been tempted to say, get out of here, you liar. Get out of my house. Get out of our house and go back. And when you stop lying, maybe we'll talk to you. Here's the first part of the news conference that they had where Abbas lied. Here's President Trump's statement.
Today I'm pleased to welcome President Abbas to the White House for his first visit to Washington in quite a while. Almost 24 years ago, it was on these grounds that President Abbas stood with a courageous peacemaker, then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Here at the White House, President Abbas signed a declaration of principles, very important, which laid the foundation for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. the President and Mr. President, you signed your name to the first Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. You remember that well, right? And I want to support you in being the Palestinian leader who signs his name to the final and most important peace agreement that brings safety, stability, prosperity to both peoples and to the region.
Well, you can see the whole press conference and the statements that were made. He doesn't. Do you understand that the pressure on anybody in that office of president and any world leaders is going to be to split up Jerusalem, split up the land, and divide things. People that support Trump are concerned about what they call mixed signals that he's given. Netanyahu came out and said bluntly, Abbas lied to Trump. But in Washington, this is from the Jerusalem Post, just I think Friday. In Washington, Abbas gets a boost for now. Caroline Glick has an article in her Friday column. She's speaking this afternoon, by the way, at the Jerusalem Post conference in New York. You can go to jpost.com and you can get the live stream of that. I think she's speaking around 3 o'clock. So you'll only miss about the first 20 minutes of it. Just kidding. I'm almost done. In France, this is things were going on. They want people to vote. French Jews that live in Israel. So they sent letters out to them, but they were addressed not to Israel, because some of them live in the settlements. They were addressed to the Palestinian territories. There is no Palestine. There really never has been. I'm going to play a clip. I'll just play the first few minutes of it. You can find it on Vox. Now, they have kind of a left-wing approach, but listen to this. What I think is one of the most bizarre places in the world. I just crossed over from Israel into the West Bank. If you look at a map of where I'm driving right now, you'll see a jumbled mess of Palestinian towns and villages, which are shown in green, and Israeli settlements, which are in blue. Many people think of this territory as Palestine, but of the 3 million people living out here, almost 20% of them are Jewish Israeli citizens. The Israelis living out here are called settlers. They live in the West Bank, but they're citizens of Israel. As I drive, I'm looking at effectively two different nations woven into each other through decades of conflict. But first, I want to take a look at the maps that help explain how the West Bank got to look like this. So let's go back to 1948, when the map looked a lot different. Back then, all this land was controlled by Great Britain. And due to growing tensions between Jews and Arabs, the UN worked with Britain to split the land into two states. One for Jews, Israel, and another one for Arabs, Palestine. The Jews in the region accepted this plan and declared independence of the State of Israel. But the Arab states in the region saw this plan as just more European colonialism. They didn't accept the plan and instead declared war on Israel. Israel won the war, pushing well past the borders of the UN plan. During the peace negotiations, a ceasefire line was drawn in green ink. It became known as the Green Line. It wasn't necessarily a border, it was just a ceasefire line, with this being the State of Israel, and this section being controlled by Jordan, who had taken control of it during the war. The Jordanians named this newly seized land the West Bank because it was west of the Jordan River. The fragile ceasefire remained until 1967, when Israel fought another war with its Arab neighbors. Israel wasn't looking to take over land in this war, but in just 6 days of fighting, it blew past the Green Line and seized a whole swath of land, including the entire West Bank. Suddenly, Israel had a decision to make. Do they make the West Bank a part of Israel and give the 1.1 million Arabs living there Israeli citizenship and voting rights? Do they give the land back to their enemy Jordan? Or else do they let the people create their own Palestinian state? This became a major debate in Israeli politics. Many Israelis saw this war they just won as not just a military victory, but a religious sign that the Jews were meant to return to the place where a huge amount of Jewish history happened. The hills of the ancient Judea and Samaria, which is basically the entire West Bank. So while the government was debating what to do, Israeli civilians began moving into the West Bank without any permission from the government. They just started setting up homes, establishing a Jewish presence in this region.
Suddenly, any debate about what to do with the West Bank had to take into account the growing number of Israeli civilians that were living there. But the rest of the world did not approve of this. As the settler presence grew, the UN issued a resolution saying that the settlements had no legal validity and that they constitute a serious obstruction to achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East. They were basically saying that this settler activity was totally illegal. Two different narratives emerged here. One said that Jewish civilians were moving on to mostly empty plots of land that they had captured in a war, and that had deep historical and spiritual significance to them. The other side, which is the side that most of the world took, said that these settlers were colonizing land to expand their nation. In spite of international condemnation, the number of settlers in the West Bank grew. Over the next few decades, more and more factions of the Israeli government began to support the settler movement, allocating public resources and granting permits for building. The Israeli Housing Ministry and military began developing plans on how to develop the West Bank. They built roads throughout the entire region, allowing easy access between the settlements and mainland Israel. More and more building permits were given out, and planned communities began popping up all over the West Bank. The settlements slowly shifted from a fringe group of motivated civilians to an institutionalized part of Israeli society, totally supported by the state. Here are the Palestinian towns in the West Bank. Watch how the settlements weave throughout these Palestinian towns. Palestinians didn't like this encroachment. They began protesting, often with extreme violence. Between the violence and the condemnations from the international community of the settlements, the situation became unsustainable. So, in the mid-1990s, American President Bill Clinton, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Accords.
Well, you can go to Vox Media on YouTube. Brian, remind me, and I'll get you the link for that to include in the video description for today's prophecy update. Watch the whole thing. It's about 10, 12 minutes long. It's very well done. I'm not even sure what Vox Media's orientation is politically. I just thought this was very fair, historically accurate, and it shows the intractable nature of the problem. And the hill country, Judea and Samaria, is a very religiously significant place for the Jewish people. People just kind of gloss over that. Our plans, if things work out, we intend to go up to places like Shechem and Shiloh and Hebron, which Hebron is where Abraham, the patriarchs, are buried. Shiloh is where the tabernacle stood for hundreds, not a couple of decades, but hundreds of years. And so hopefully we'll be able to take a look at that in the next week and a half. But again, I'll just step back and finish this up with the convergence of things related to the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, the city of Jerusalem are converging. On the day that Israel celebrates its anniversary of independence, the UN, through UNESCO, and their people that they support, the Hamas, issue things against Israel. On Jerusalem Day, which will be celebrated on May 24th, the 2 days before that, President Trump is going to be there on his... Man, I could have sworn I had a slide for this. He's going 3 places on his trip. He's going first to Saudi Arabia. Then he goes from there to Israel. One day in Jerusalem. He's going to go down to Bethlehem for the other day. And then he goes to the Vatican. And it's being called the monotheistic tour of Donald Trump. Now, I'm troubled by it. I'm pretty sure the plan is for him on May 22nd to go to the Western Wall, to the Kotel, to the Wailing Wall, which the Jews didn't get to go to from like 1948 to 1967 because Jordan controlled it. They used it as a dump. Very respectful of the Jewish rights to that, weren't they? Even though they had published back in the 1920s a thing that talked about the Jewish Solomon's temple, the Jewish temple. The Muslim, or the Waqf that runs the Temple Mount today, published this. You can find the pamphlet online. So Trump will go to the Wailing Wall. I doubt that the Palestinians would let him up on the Temple Mount, but he'll go to the Wailing Wall. Do you think he's going to go to Mecca when he's in Saudi Arabia? Unless he wants to get killed on the spot, he's not going to go. And then he's going to go to the Vatican. I know he has to do certain things as president, okay? So just, pray for him that he does the right thing. Look, the problem is, prophetically, we know how all this pans out. We know what happens. And it appears that those events are very right on the verge of happening. And our country is involved in it, at least right now. And that's troubling because we know the near term is a false peace and security. Then we know that there's destruction, but then we know the Lord returns. So, to me, I always view Bible prophecy as kind of I got to focus on that far end game. The return of the king, the defeat of the armies of the earth that oppose him, and the establishment of his kingdom. But in between there, a lot of people that we know, and even us to a large degree, I think, will suffer persecution for our faith. So the near term, I don't want to suffer persecution. Okay? I mean, I live in Dublin, Ohio, for crying out loud. How rough is my life? It's funny, I was complaining to Pam the other night. Did driving get more difficult recently? I mean, have you noticed this around town that, I have people pulling out in front of me. There's accidents every night on the way home. And what used to take me 20 minutes now takes me 45 or 50. And it just seems like people are, and so it's frustrating to me. But then I also have to temper it with, my life's not that bad. I'm not really suffering that much. But there's no guarantee that I won't. And all the trends and cultures seem to indicate that we will. But we know that the end works out pretty good for all of us, and God will be glorified. So we need to keep that in mind and hold each other up in prayer. And pray for each other. And stop hijacking Facebook threads to argue your point when your people are asking for prayer. And let's pray and leave. Father, give us the peace of the Holy Spirit, His guidance, a commitment for us to stay in your word where you've laid out what we need to know. And that we'll pray for our leaders and for the people around us that will have opportunities to share the gospel with them, which they desperately need more than anything else. More than food, more than money, more than health care. They need the gospel. Give us strength this week. In Jesus' name, amen.